Imagine standing on a grand stage, the weight of the moment pressing down like an invisible force. The cameras flashed, the murmurs of the crowd filled the air, and at the center of it all stood Barron Trump, tall, composed, yet visibly shaken. He had delivered speeches before. He had stood before thousands, but this moment, this was different. His gaze scanned the sea of faces, a mix of admiration, curiosity, and skepticism staring back. And then, his breath hitched. There, in the middle of the crowd, partially hidden behind a few familiar political figures, was a face he never expected to see again. A face that belonged to someone from a life he had long left behind. His teacher. The woman who once believed in him when no one else did. The woman who had changed everything. For a second, time slowed. The walls of that grand ballroom melted away, and suddenly, he wasn't Barron Trump, the son of one of the most powerful men in the world. He wasn't the young man navigating an existence under relentless public scrutiny. He was just a kid again, sitting in a dimly lit classroom, hanging on to every word she spoke, desperate to prove that he was more than just a last name. A lump formed in his throat as the memory washed over him, raw and vivid. Back then, she had been the only person to truly see him. Not as the son of a billionaire, not as a political figure's child, but as a boy, trying to carve out his own identity in a world that had already decided who he should be. And yet, he had let her down. His heart pounded against his ribcage. Did she remember? Did she still see him the way she once did? Or was he now just another name, another person swallowed up by the expectations he had been born into? And then, it happened. Their eyes met, and in that single instant, he knew. Everything was about to change. Barron Trump was used to being watched, scrutinized, judged before he ever had the chance to speak. It had been that way his entire life, long before he understood why people whispered when he entered a room, long before he knew that his name carried a weight far beyond his own actions. But there was a time, before the headlines, before the expectations, when he had been just a boy in a classroom, a boy who wanted, more than anything, to prove that he was more than just his last name, and she had seen that. Mrs. Taylor, she had been different from the others. Most teachers, whether they admitted it or not, had treated him differently. Some walked on eggshells, afraid to correct him, worried that one misstep would bring consequences beyond the classroom. Others did the opposite, going out of their way to be cold, to prove that they wouldn't be soft on the president's son. Either way, it was never normal, never real. But Mrs. Taylor, she had been real. She had never once hesitated to call him out when he was wrong. Never once let him slide by on half-hearted efforts. She challenged him, pushed him, and demanded that he be better. Not because of who his father was, but because she saw who he could become, and that's why it had hurt so much. Because in the end, when it mattered most, he had failed her. It started small, missed assignments, lack of focus, the weight of the world outside that classroom pressing in. He told himself it didn't matter. That school was just a formality. That no matter what, people would see him the way they wanted to, either as a spoiled rich kid who didn't deserve what he had, or as someone who could never live up to his father. So why try? Why pretend that any of it made a difference? Mrs. Taylor had tried. More than once, she had pulled him aside, her voice firm but kind, her eyes full of something he couldn't quite name. You are not your last name, Barron. You are you. But if you don't take control of your own story, the world will write it for you. He had nodded, acted like he understood, but he hadn't listened. And then came the moment, the one he could never forget. A final project. One that meant everything for his grade. One that Mrs. Taylor had reminded him of again and again, her voice carrying the same quiet urgency as a mother warning her child not to touch a flame. But he had ignored her. It wasn't that he meant to. It wasn't that he didn't care. Life had just happened. And in his world, life wasn't normal. One day, he was in class. The next, he was being whisked away for security reasons. One moment, he was a student. The next, he was a headline, and so, when the day came, he had nothing to show. The look on her face, disappointment, not anger, had been worse than any punishment, worse than any lecture. Not even an attempt, she had asked softly, shaking her head. Barron, you are capable of so much more than this. He had wanted to say something, to explain, but what could he say? That night, the school had called home. And the next morning, he had been pulled from her class. Just like that. He never got to apologize, never got to fix it. And deep down, a part of him had always wondered, had she given up on him after that? Had she written him off as just another privileged kid who wasted his potential? And now, all these years later, she was standing in the crowd, watching him. Did she still see the boy she had believed in? Or just another name in the headlines? The weight of it pressed down on him, harder than any public appearance ever had. Because this wasn't just about a speech. This was about redemption. For a moment, Barron couldn't breathe. The room, the crowd, the cameras, all of it blurred into the background. The only thing that mattered was the woman standing before him, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. He had faced scrutiny from the world's harshest, critics. He had been analyzed, dissected, and judged by people who had never spoken a word to him. And yet, none of them had ever made him feel as small as he did in this moment. Because she wasn't just another voice in the crowd. She wasn't just another person with an opinion. She was the only teacher who had ever seen through the walls he had built. The only one who had believed in him long before he had ever believed in himself. And he had let her down. That truth struck, harder than any political attack, harder than any headline or scandal. It was raw, unfiltered, and impossible to escape. He had failed her. And now, after all these years, she was here, watching him, waiting. But for what? Did she expect an apology, acknowledgement? Did she even care anymore? Or worse, did she regret ever believing in him at all? His pulse pounded in his ears. The weight of his past pressed down like an invisible force, suffocating him. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something he thought he had buried long ago. Doubt. Maybe he wasn't the man she had once believed he could become. Maybe the world had been right about him all along. What was he doing here? What was the point? For years, he had worked tirelessly to step out of his father's shadow, to prove that he was his own person, that he could stand on his own. But no matter what he did, no matter how much he tried, he was still seen as just a last name, a legacy, a product of circumstance, rather than a man who had built something of his own. And now, standing here, frozen in time, he wondered if he had been lying to himself all along. Because if he was truly different, if he had truly grown beyond the boy who had sat in Mrs. Taylor's classroom all those years ago, then why was he still running from his past? Why had he never reached out, never made it right? Why had he let himself believe that just because the world had already judged him, he didn't have the power to change the story? A familiar voice echoed in his mind. Not his father's. Not the countless critics who had spoken his name over the years. Hers. You are not your last name, Barron. You are you. But if you don't take control of your own story, the world will write it for you. For years he had tried to forget those words, tried to silence them, because listening to them meant facing the truth, that he had a choice, that he had always had a choice, and that terrified him. Because if he had a choice, then every failure, every missed opportunity, every moment where he had let doubt win, had been on him, not the media, not the expectations, not the name, him. The realization hit like a tidal wave, swallowing him whole. He had spent his whole life fighting against the weight of his father's legacy, desperate to prove that he was different, but in doing so, he had let that very legacy define him. He had let the world convince him that he was powerless, that no matter what he did, no matter how hard he worked, people would always see him as something he wasn't. But Mrs. Taylor had never seen him that way. She had never looked at him and seen just a name. She had seen potential. She had seen strength. She had seen a boy who could become something more, and maybe, just maybe, she still did. His hands clenched at his sides. The doubt, the fear, the weight of the past. It didn't disappear, but for the first time in a long time, he refused to let it control him. Because this moment, this speech, wasn't about proving something to the world. It was about proving something to himself. Slowly, he exhaled, forcing his gaze to meet hers. The noise of the room came rushing back, the cameras still rolling, the whispers still spreading through the crowd. But none of it mattered anymore, because he had made his choice. He wasn't going to let the world write his story. He was going to take back the pen. The room seemed to hold its breath as Barron finally stepped forward. The weight that had been pressing down on him moments ago was still there, but now it felt different. It was no longer something he was trying to escape. It was something he was about to face. He cleared his throat, scanning the crowd. The cameras were locked onto him. Every expression, every movement, ready to be dissected by the world. But this time, he wasn't thinking about them. He wasn't thinking about the reporters waiting to twist his words, or the analysts eager to compare him to his father. He was thinking about her, Mrs. Taylor. His voice was steady when he finally spoke. "Before I say anything else," he began, "I need to acknowledge someone in this room. Someone I owe more than I've ever admitted." A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. People exchanged glances, unsure of where he was going. He could already imagine the headlines forming. Barron Trump caught off guard. Barron loses composure in speech. Let them speculate. Let them guess. For once, they didn't know the story before he told it. His gaze locked onto Mrs. Taylor. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. But there was something in her expression, an unreadable mix of curiosity and something deeper, something hesitant. "I once had a teacher," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "A teacher who saw me not as the son of someone powerful, not as a name on a roster that came with baggage, but as a person, as a kid who could be more." The whispers grew louder. He could feel the tension rising in the room, the collective realization that this moment, this speech, wasn't going to be what they expected. "She pushed me when I needed it. She made sure I never settled for less than what I was capable of. And when I failed, because I did fail, she didn't get angry. She didn't scold me. She was disappointed. And that was worse." He let the words settle, let the weight of them sink in. He wasn't just talking to the room, he was talking to her. "Mrs. Taylor," he said finally, voice quieter now, more personal. "I never got to thank you. I never got to say I was sorry." For a long moment, she didn't speak. The room felt frozen, the energy shifting in a way no one had anticipated. Then slowly, she stood. "Barron," she said, her voice carrying the same warmth it always had. "You don't have to apologize." His chest tightened. He had carried that failure for so long, convinced that she had written him off, that he had been nothing more than another student who didn't live up to what he could have been. But now, standing before her, seeing the way her eyes softened, he realized something he hadn't before. She had never given up on him. Not then. Not now. She smiled. A real, genuine smile. "I always knew you'd figure it out." The shift in the room was palpable. The carefully constructed narrative that had been built around him, one of privilege, of expectation, of a man defined by his last name, was crumbling. Because in that moment, he wasn't a Trump. He was a student, standing before a teacher who had once believed in him, and that was something no headline, no debate, no judgmental gaze could take away. He straightened his shoulders, He had spent so much of his life trying to prove himself to the world, trying to fight against a legacy he never chose. But now, he realized, he didn't have to prove anything to anyone except himself. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The crowd erupted into applause, not the polite, rehearsed kind, but something real, something raw. People stood, some wiping their eyes, some clapping harder than they ever had at any speech. But for Barron, there was only one person in the room who mattered. Mrs. Taylor gave him a small nod, and for the first time in years, he felt something lift off his shoulders. This was his moment, his story, and he had just rewritten it. The applause swelled around him, but Barron barely heard it. In that moment, the noise didn't matter. The cameras, the headlines, the endless cycle of public scrutiny, none of it held the same weight. It once did. Because this wasn't about proving anything to the world anymore. This was about something much deeper. He had spent years trying to outrun his past, trying to carve out an identity separate from the name he was born into. He had believed, for so long, that no matter what he did, the world would see only one version of him, the one that fit into whatever narrative they wanted to tell. But Mrs. Taylor had never seen him that way. And now, as he stood before her, he realized something he never had before. She had never needed an apology. She had never held on to disappointment the way he had, because she had always known that one day he would find his way. The weight he had carried for so long, the regret, the what-ifs, it all melted away in that single moment of understanding. The applause finally faded, and for the first time in years, Barron felt lighter. He didn't need to hold on to the past anymore. He didn't need to punish himself for the mistakes of his younger self. He had learned, he had grown, and now he had the chance to move forward. But there was something else. A lesson that had been staring him in the face for years, waiting for him to see it. The world would always try to define him. They would always try to shape him into something that fit their own expectations. But he didn't have to let them. For so long, he had believed that power was something external, something that came from status, from success, from proving people wrong. But real power came from knowing who you were, regardless of what anyone else thought. And in that moment, Barron knew exactly who he was. Not just the son of a former president, not just a name in the headlines. He was Barron. And that was enough. Turned to Mrs. Taylor one last time, offering her a small smile, the kind of smile that held years of unspoken gratitude. She returned it, her eyes shining with the kind of pride that didn't need words. No cameras could capture this. No headlines could twist it, because this moment wasn't for the world. It was for them. Barron stepped down from the stage, walking through the crowd with a newfound sense of clarity. The whispers, the scrutiny, the judgment. They no longer mattered the way they once did, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't walking in anyone's shadow. He was walking in his own light. And no one, not the media, not the critics, not even the expectations placed upon him could take that away.